Welcome to Beyond the Paper Gown. I'm your host, Dr. Mitzi Krockover. Today's episode sits right at the intersection of women's health, innovation, and impact, and it tackles a question I hear all the time. Why does women's health still struggle to get the attention, resources, including investment, and urgency it deserves, despite affecting half the population? My guest today is Anna Jeter, co-founder, along with her business partners Oriana Poppin-Zogby and Alex Fisher of AOA DX, where she also serves as Chief Regulatory Officer. AOA is a company focused on the early detection of ovarian cancer, one of the most lethal cancers affecting women, precisely because it's so hard to diagnose early. Anna has spent more than 15 years working in women's health, particularly in diagnostics and regulatory strategy, helping translate complex science into real-world tools that can change outcomes for patients. But Anna's here today for another reason as well. She is the co-author of a groundbreaking report titled Women's Health Exits, a data-driven analysis of returns, acquisitions, and the maturation of a sector. This report challenges one of the most persistent myths in healthcare and investing, that women's health is niche, risky, or unproven. What Anna and her team did was simple but powerful. They went back more than 2 decades and documented what actually has happened: real companies, real acquisitions, real returns. And what they found fundamentally reframes how we should think about women's health innovation. So even if you've never heard the term exit, even if you're not an investor, this conversation matters because investment shapes which technologies get built, which treatments reach patients, and how quickly life-saving care becomes available. So today we're going to unpack why this report is such a turning point, what investment outcomes have to do with earlier diagnosis, better treatments, and access to care, and how changing the financial narrative around women's health ultimately changes women's lives. Well, let's ask the obvious. What is AOA DX, and what brings you to that company?
Absolutely. So AOA DX was founded about 5 years ago. I am one of the co-founders, and I have 2 fantastic other co-founders, Oriana and Alex. And we had worked together for 15 years in women's health. And when we founded AOA, it was really with a goal in order to improve women's lives and women's health. So AOA DX is dedicated to early detection of ovarian cancer. We're looking at those women who are arriving at their providers with signs and symptoms. Today, there are really no tools to help those women, and on average, the diagnosis takes 9 months. Ovarian cancer is an extremely fast-growing cancer, so you go from stage 1 to stage 4 in under a year, and 80% of the disease is diagnosed at late stages, which correlates exactly to the amount of time it takes us to do the diagnosis in the US. Because the women are arriving, they have fairly vague symptoms: abdominal pain, changes in urinary or bowel movements, bloating. A lot of times it's ascribed to much more benign conditions like menopause, like GI, irritable bowel syndrome, and in many cases dismissed, or a wait and see approach is adopted. And in that case, the cancer grows. And what we wanted to do is really address this issue to bring a diagnostic test that is able to very quickly stratify the women who are high risk and need the appropriate follow-up from those that it truly may be a benign condition and they need a GI follow-up. So that's what AOA is focused on.
Where are you in the process of getting this to market?
So we have just finished enrolling our clinical trial, a very large clinical trial across the US, and we are in very active discussions with the FDA.
Well, I would love to have you come on and talk more about this because it's obviously such an important product and subject, and maybe when you're farther down the pathway, we can have you do that. But the reason I had you come on here as well is to talk about the report that you and your business partner co-authored about women's health exits. So give us an elevator pitch about what this report is and does, and why you all in the midst of all the things that you are doing and how busy you are, thought that it was really important to take time to actually create this report as well.
Yes, absolutely. So the reason why we created this report is because Oriana, my business partner, and I were having dinner one night. And as an early stage company, we're constantly fundraising, right? That's just the reality. And what we are hearing ourselves from investors, but also what our friends and colleagues are hearing in the field is that investors are waiting for that first exit, that first big exit that will really anchor women's health as a real sector. And they say we see the opportunity, we see the potential. In the last few years, there's been amazing number of reports on the opportunity of women's health, the future, right? What it could be, the $1 trillion opportunity. But the way investors see it is they have to show returns to their LPs, right? Everybody has a boss. Everybody
The
has to
limited
show.
partners. Yeah.
Right. This works. This is why this is a good bet and this is a good investment. And there's this perception that there haven't been any exits to anchor the space to actually say, I can go back to the people who invest in me and tell them this is a good bet because we have had XYZ amount of success, right? Most of us do pattern recognition, right? And so if we've seen something succeed in the past, we assume it will succeed in the future. And when you're investing or doing something brand new, it is considered to be a lot more high risk. And as we're sitting there, we've been in women's health for 15 years. We ourselves have been part of two very successful women's health exits. At the time when we were at QIAGEN, which is a very large diagnostics company out of Europe, they had acquired Digene for $1.6 billion. That was back in something around like 2006, in the early 2000s for HPV screening, a single asset company for $1.6 billion. And so we're sitting there and just off the top of our head, because we're in the space, we could name a number of billion-dollar exits. And we said, but what about this one? What about this one? What about this one? What do you mean they're waiting? What do you mean they're waiting for the first one? Because we know how many there are. And so as we're having dinner, we said, what is missing in this space is really a reclassification, that this Digene wasn't just a diagnostics exit, it was also a women's health exit. But today, nobody thinks of it that way, right? Everything that has happened in the past fell into legacy categories, whether it's therapeutic, whether that's diagnostic, oncology. A lot of items are under equipment, right, rather than women's health. And so when we started to talk about it, we said, we want to do a report. And I worked very closely with somebody on my team, Emma Giancarlo, who is fantastic. She has her MBA from Fordham, and we worked very closely together to put together a database. And we said, okay, let's go back from the year 2000 and create a database of all of the exits that have happened that are actually women's health. And we created a very strict definition for ourselves, right? Because at some point, women's health becomes all health as well. And so we did want to ensure that it falls into the categories we've described. And we compiled a database looking through PitchBook, looking through press releases of companies, going out to our investor and network community to really source all of the exits that are available. We ensured that only publicly available information is included, because there are also many, many exits where they are not publicly announced and the exit value may not be publicly announced. And so we knew of several of those, but in order to make sure that our database was very credible, we used only those with publicly available information. And from there, we really wanted to calculate, what is the size of this market, right? It's not nascent, it's not new, there is no reason to wait. It's actually quite mature. And to change that conversation and perception with proof and with real data and with real numbers.
That's terrific. And you had a lot of partners, I think, that helped you with that. Do you want to mention some of them?
Yes, so we work very closely with Foreground Capital. Alice Zhang, she's fantastic. We worked with several of our investors who really helped us to ensure that the framing of the report spoke to the investor because that was our goal, right? We worked closely with Good Growth Capital. HSBC and Catherine Anderson was just fantastic to work with too. They have a lot of interest in the space because they see a lot of the companies, right, that are doing this work, and that it's not nascent, it's not small. They've seen a lot of success with it, and so it's been just fantastic to partner. Liz Powell from Women's Health Advocates is a superstar and a force, and I would say anybody anybody in the space should be working with her, and the work that she's doing on the Hill is really fantastic. And then, of course, investors, the investors who are betting, right, who are betting in this space, who have successful exits in this space, who perhaps were told, ooh, this is really risky. And now they're seeing a lot of opportunity, and they're seeing the huge exits that have come out of it.
There are a lot of listeners here who might not be in the investment space or the innovation space specifically, or never heard the word exit in this context. How does a successful exit actually translate to the average person, especially women, into earlier diagnosis, better treatment, or even more time with family? Basically, what's the impact on outcomes?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I would say there's two lenses that I would look at that with. Lens number one, what an exit is it's a transaction. It's either a merger or acquisition, or an IPO, which is a public offering where a company becomes a public company. What it means to investors is that investors get their money back that they bet into the company, and then some, right? The goal is that they get more money than they put into the company, because that's their job. And what it does from an investment perspective is that when investors are getting exits or money back into their fund that they invested, then they want to invest into more companies in the same category to generate the returns. So what does it mean for patients? It means investors will be investing in more women's health companies, in more perhaps early detection or treatments that are impactful to women, because they see that their bets are working out, right? So that's what it means from the earlier on in terms of company formation and working on ideas and working on products and solutions that impact women. And that's very important because you have to be building that funnel of companies that are going to be addressing those needs. What does it mean to the patient themselves when a company exits? It is generally considered to be a scaling moment for that company, right? An exit typically represents that the company now goes from perhaps a small startup to being acquired by somebody like a Hologic or a Cooper Surgical or a Qiagen, right? A large company with a huge sales force, a huge imprint around the world that is able to handle distribution, reimbursement expertise. They have global reach. And so that these products have the opportunity to actually get into the hands of every single provider and every single patient and be used a lot more routinely. And as a patient, of course, that's very important to you that not only a subsegment of the population has access to this brand new technology, but that in fact it is spread throughout our entire healthcare system, so it can actually make the impact that this new technology promises to bring.
And when you talked about the investor piece, it dawns on me, we were just at JPM Healthcare Conference, which is a large conference focused on innovation in general and biosciences. And there was such a great groundswell of women's health activities and so forth. But it also dawns on me that, again, when we think about investment right now, there are all these funds that are very much focused on women's health. But what I think is so interesting about what you just said is that it opens the eyes, hopefully, of any investor, whether or not they think of themselves as a women's health investor, but perhaps just as a health investor or a life science investor, understanding the value of this sector.
Yes, absolutely. I think what we've seen in the last 5 to 10 years there's been a big emergence of women's health funds. Today, they tend to be more earlier seed stage funds. Um, and what we are seeing is as the company enters the growth stage, they need different amount of funding. And today, the women's health funds are not yet large enough to handle the growth stage companies. And so you almost mature from this seed stage environment where there's a lot of focus on women's health to your very traditional life science funds that have the ability to write the really large checks. And what we need to ensure is that at the seed stage, there's now a fantastic understanding of the opportunity and the returns in women's health. At the growth stage, not yet, and there's quite a bit of education that needs to be done in that space. Now, I know of many funds that are currently raising to be those growth funds, and it will happen and it will come, but we're just not there quite yet. And so it's really
I mean, focused on
important
women's
that
health.
yes, focused
Sorry.
on women's health, exactly.
Mhm.
And so it's really important that the more traditional funds understand the opportunity and that they want to write those checks to help those companies to recruit large clinical studies, for example, or to get through FDA, for example, right, to hire sales teams and so on.
You know, you were at JPM. There was so much interest in what you all are doing. And what was the general reaction, perhaps outside of those women's health events and activities, in more of the general investors? Did you get any reactions? And how do you think you've moved the needle?
I think there's been a lot of interest. I think people really like that this is a different data with different angle, and that is actually showing proof and going back and looking at real exits and returns rather than future opportunity and kind of modeling what could be achieved. It's what has been achieved. Um, and I think that's really exciting. I think people are a little bit tired of hearing, well, women's health only gets 2% of all the investment dollars, but what does it actually mean? We're able to achieve heck of a lot with just 2% of those investment dollars. And just imagine if that number doubles, triples, or, hopefully
Right.
100x's, frankly. But I think there was a lot of significant interest in the fact that this was, in fact, an investor story, that it actually showed real returns and what has happened in the field. I think we still have work to do on changing perception. What I've seen is that perception is still, it's hard to change. It's a little bit of ingrained, but with all the work that people are doing in the space, and our report is just a fraction of the work that people are doing in the space. You can't give up. Um, you have to show that there's opportunity, and we really have to be working in the world that we have, right, to change it to become the world that we want. And I think this is just a part of it.
Sure. Nearly half of these exits happened in the last 5 years, which I thought was kind of interesting. What do you think is driving the acceleration? And, um, do you see that continuing?
We very much see that continuing. I mean, if you look at, so when we were doing the report, obviously it was done in 2025, right? So we had the full data for 2024. And you look at 2024 and it is a significant acceleration. All of a sudden, it looks like a standout year. And even as we're writing the report, we said this is not a standout year. It is going to continue. This is a trend. What happens when 2025 comes around as we're doing the report? You have some of the largest women's health exits ever reported, right? Hologic is acquired by private equity for over 18 billion. You have Billion to One, which is NIPT, which is purely women's health, right? Doing an IPO public offering for 4.4 billion. And you have other vaginal based companies with $1 billion exits. And this is just very partial data from 2025, right? This is just like headlines. When we eventually do an update on the report and include the year, that number is going to grow significantly. And what it's showing you is really a trend and a big projection of the exits that are in the pipeline, and all of those companies that have been, those seed stage companies that were being invested in, that are now at the exit stage, that are now at the area that they can that they can go into the main market. They have the regulatory approvals that are necessary for their field to go to patients.
As we're speaking, it dawns on me that, again, you looked at data before 2025, just as you were describing, and a lot of these exits happened not as women's health exits, just as, the advantage of doing good business and having good products and good financial opportunities. So do you see the kind of increased awareness of the importance of women's health helping to perhaps magnify some of this going forward, or being a factor, as well as the fact that these are good products?
Mm-hmm. I think that the strategic companies that are building their businesses, when you think about who we collaborated on the report with, somebody like LabCorp, right, who today does a lot of diagnostic testing, they see women's health as a huge area of growth, right? As every company, no matter what company you are, when you're doing your planning or your strategic planning, you say, where is the next place that I can go that I believe is going to succeed, right? And for many companies today, that's actually women's health. And a lot of the strategics that we talk to as well understand that there's built up demand. We know that women control about 80% of all healthcare spending, right? We know that women live in much poorer health they live longer, but they also live longer in poorer health. We know that they're actually going to the doctor, they're seeking care, and they want answers. And I think this generation of women, like mine or older, that have access to the internet, education, they want answers. They don't just want to say, hey, menopause has been this hidden thing and I should live in shame. They're saying, no, there are solutions. I know there are solutions and I want those solutions to improve my life. Similar with endometriosis, we're not okay that it's taking 7 years to diagnose this. PCOS is 10% of all women. Imagine if something impacted 10% of all men. We would have solutions for that, but it's still somehow considered small. And so as these large companies are looking at, okay, what's my outlook for the next 10 years? Where do I make investments that are going to impact our bottom line, but also impact the lives of patients, which is important to them? They're seeing women's health as this big opportunity in an underserved market.
You anticipated my next question, basically, what conditions are we still needing to address? But you named a number of very female-specific conditions. And then there are those conditions that impact women, such as cardiovascular disease, autoimmune diseases, osteoporosis, but again, maybe predominantly or differently manifest in women, but certainly affect both sexes. How do we make the case, if you will, to make sure that diagnostics, therapeutics, devices address those for women's special needs?
Mm-hmm. I think there are multiple ways to look at it, right? And I think that one, I can talk about the company perspective. As a diagnostic or as a drug, reimbursement from health insurance companies or Medicare is largely driven by your performance. If you are able to understand the underlying sex-specific differences that are driving performance, you will be able to achieve better results, and therefore you'll be able to have higher adoption in the market, right, by clinicians and by patients, and higher reimbursement because your product works better. Those companies and those drugs that understand the sex-specific differences and are able to achieve much better results in either men or women, right, rather than lumping everybody together, they are going to see the significant benefits to their bottom line, to their profitability, to their patients, because they are able to deliver much better healthcare. And I think today companies are starting to understand that.
For a founder, building in any of these specifically women's health areas, whether it be menopause, maternal health, or oncology, who may be about to walk into a pitch meeting, what's the insight from this report that they can use to improve their ability to fundraise?
So if you're going to the pitch, what I would focus on is that women's health is not niche or altruistic. It's not that everybody has a mother, a sister, a daughter, perhaps, and that's what you're trying to kind of maybe tug at their heartstrings. But this is actually really good business. And investors, they all also have bosses, just like most of us have bosses. They also have bosses of those who invest into them. And unless you are an impact fund that really focuses on these much more altruistic angles, they all have to deliver results and they all have to deliver return on investment. And what I would really focus on is that this is not a niche or an altruistic category. This is a category that provides fantastic returns. It has proven exits. It has proven market. It has proven acquirers who are looking to take those companies to the next level. And this is just a really good opportunity to do the return on investment for that particular fund. And also show them, look at the companies, look at the 27 billion-dollar unicorn exits. And this is how we are similar to them. This is how maybe we can become like them, or this is how you can work in that pattern recognition where they succeeded and where you can succeed as well, to make them understand that this is a valuable and profitable area to be in, and that we can all do well by doing good, right? That's the number one goal. And I think that everything that happens in healthcare, we all need to generate those returns on investment, and we're actually improving the health and lives of people every day as well.
My next question is, what's your hope for 5 years from now? Maybe when you're doing volume 2 of the report.
So my hope is that in 5 years that the perception changes that women's health is a niche field. What I am certain of is that we're going to see a lot more blockbuster exits that address some of the challenges that we have in healthcare today and that women are having, and that investors are going to change this perception and see that this is a large strategic category. I also think there's a little bit on us as well to change the narrative. There's a little bit of, oh no, women's health only gets 2% of the funding, and to some extent that might be true, but also how much we're able to accomplish with it. And so what I would like to see is that a lot more money is flowing into women's health companies, is that they are getting, the right valuations, the right exits, and that the more that we invest in these companies, the more shot on goal we have to solve some of the bigger challenges that we have in women's health, whether that's autoimmune disease or Alzheimer's or cardiovascular. These companies all need funding to make a difference. And what I want investors to see is that when they hear women's health, they don't shy away from it as, oh, I'm nervous, this is new, I'm not sure how it's going to perform. But what they say is, women's health, that's where the opportunity is. And that's where I want to invest my dollars, because I know that that's where I'll generate my next 100 billion in returns.
Well, this report has certainly been that huge first step, both as someone who mentors founders and invests in these companies and tries to get more investment in this space. This report has given us so much information in terms of changing perspectives and reframing the issue. So thank you so much, Anna Jeter, for joining us today and for having this very important conversation.
Thank you, and thank you for having me.
As we wrap up today's conversation, I want to leave you with one key takeaway. What Anna and her colleagues have shown in Women's Health Exits, a data-driven analysis of returns, acquisitions, and the maturation of a sector, is that women's health is not an unproven sector, but one that has been mislabeled, misunderstood, and under-recognized. Successful exits aren't just financial milestones, they're inflection points. They determine whether a promising diagnostic reaches clinics nationwide, whether a breakthrough technology scales globally, and whether innovation moves fast enough to meet women where they are and when they need it most. So for patients, that can mean earlier diagnosis instead of months or years of dismissal, better treatments designed with women in mind, and more time, more health, and more quality of life. For founders, clinicians, and advocates, this report offers something powerful, evidence that women's health is not charity, it's not niche, it's not a side conversation. It's good medicine and good business. If this episode changed the way you think about women's health, innovation, or impact, I hope you'll share it, because shifting the narrative is how real change begins, and we all can play our part in achieving that change. For more information on this issue and other important topics in women's health, subscribe to this podcast and give us a rating. You can also sign up for our newsletter at beyondthepapergown.com. Thank you for listening, and until next time, take good care. Our episode was produced by Patrick Shambayati and me, and our associate producer is Kyla McMillian.